The year is 1959. The location is the absolute center of the Antarctic continent. Outside, the temperature is minus 112 degrees Fahrenheit. It is a cold so profound that it turns rubber into glass and steel into brittle crystal. The wind is screaming across the ice sheet at 80 miles per hour. If you stepped out of the airlock without a thermal suit, you would be dead in less than 3 minutes. Your lungs would freeze from the inside out. But you are not outside. You are sitting in an armchair, wearing a light sweater, smoking a cigarette, and playing a game of chess. Underneath your feet, the floorboards are vibrating with the rhythmic power of a massive V12 diesel engine. Through the thick, frost-covered portholes, you can see the white desert rolling by at 6 miles per hour. You are riding inside the Kharkovchanka, the woman from Kharkov. While the Americans were looking to the stars, launching rockets to conquer space, the Soviet Union was launching a different kind of mission to conquer the most hostile surface on Earth. They didn't build a spaceship, they built a land ship. A 35-ton nuclear-proof luxury apartment building mounted on top of tank tracks. It remains one of the most successful and terrifying vehicles ever built. For 50 years, these orange monsters roamed the frozen wasteland, serving as the only lifeline for the men who dared to live at the bottom of the world. This is the story of the Soviet land train that succeeded where everyone else failed. To understand why this machine exists, we have to look at the other Cold War. We all know about the space race, but in the late 1950s, there was a desperate race to claim Antarctica. The United States had already established a base at the South Pole. The Soviets needed to make a statement. They decided to claim the pole of inaccessibility. This is the point on the continent that is furthest from any ocean. It is harder to reach than the South Pole. It is higher, colder, and more dangerous. To get there, they needed a vehicle that didn't exist. They looked at the American attempt from 1939, the Antarctic snow cruiser. That was a massive wheeled vehicle that failed miserably because its smooth tires spun helplessly on the ice. It moved 10 feet and gave up. The Soviet engineers at the Kharkov transport engineering plant in Ukraine looked at that failure and learned a valuable lesson. Do not use wheels, use brute force. They took the chassis of the ATT heavy artillery tractor, which itself was based on the legendary T-54 main battle tank. They lengthened the hull by 2 massive road wheels. They widened the tracks to an insane 1 meter across. That is over 3 feet of steel, gripping the snow on each side. But the real revolution was the body. Up until this point, polar explorers lived in tents or cramped tractors. They froze. They got frostbite. They were miserable. The designers of the Kharkovchanka decided that if men were going to travel 2,000 miles across the ice, they shouldn't just survive, they should live. They built a rectangular steel superstructure that looked like a railway carriage. It was massive, 28 feet long and 13 feet wide. The walls were insulated with 8 layers of industrial wool and asbestos, sealed against the polar wind. Inside, it was like a Soviet apartment. It had a sleeping cabin with bunk beds for 6 men. It had a galley kitchen with an electric stove to bake bread. It had a mess hall for eating and socializing. It had a radio room to talk to Moscow. It had a navigation station. It even had a toilet and a small library. But there was one design choice that turned this luxury cruiser into a torture chamber. In a normal truck, the engine is in front of the driver, under a hood. But in Antarctica, if an engine breaks down outside, you cannot fix it. Your hands would freeze instantly. So the engineers put the massive 39-liter diesel engine inside the cabin. It sat right in the middle of the living space, occupying a quarter of the interior volume. This meant the mechanics could work on the engine in their shirt sleeves, warm and safe. But it also meant that the crew was sleeping next to a roaring industrial beast. The noise was deafening. The crew had to shout to communicate. The vibration rattled the dishes on the table 24 hours a day. And then there was the soot. The exhaust system wasn't perfect. As the Kharkovchanka clawed its way up the Antarctic plateau, diesel fumes would leak into the living quarters. The men lived in a constant blue haze of smoke. They had chronic headaches. Their clothes, their sheets, and their food all tasted like diesel fuel. But despite the noise and the fumes, the machine was a masterpiece of off-road capability. On December 26, 1959, a convoy of 3 Kharkovchankas set off from Vostok Station, heading for the geographic South Pole. It was a journey into the unknown. As they climbed higher onto the polar plateau, the air got thinner. The engines began to choke. They lost power. The black smoke inside the cabin got thicker. The turbochargers were glowing red-hot. The men were suffering from altitude sickness. They were dizzy and nauseous, fighting to breathe in the thin air while inhaling toxic fumes. And yet, the land trains kept moving. The massive tracks floated over soft snow that would have swallowed a normal tank. They crushed sastrugi, ridges of hard ice as tall as a man, without slowing down. But the ice had hidden traps. Antarctica is essentially a giant glacier moving towards the sea. As it moves, it cracks. These cracks are called crevasses. Some are a few inches wide, some are wide enough to swallow a building, and they are often covered by a thin, deceptive bridge of snow. Driving a 35-ton vehicle over a minefield of crevasses is a game of Russian roulette. The driver sat high up in a glass cockpit at the front, scanning the white horizon for subtle changes in the color of the snow. There is a terrifying story from one of these expeditions. The lead Kharkhovchanka was breaking the trail. Suddenly, the rear of the vehicle dropped. The snow bridge had collapsed. The massive tracks clawed at the air, spinning uselessly. The 35-ton monster was teetering on the lip of a black abyss that went down hundreds of feet into the blue ice. The crew inside felt the floor tilt. The plates slid off the table. They scrambled to the front of the cabin. If they fell, there was no rescue. No crane in the world could lift them out. They would be entombed forever. Desperately, the second Kharkovchanka in the convoy maneuvered behind them. The crew braved the freezing wind to hook up heavy steel tow cables. With engines screaming and black smoke pouring into the sky, the second vehicle pulled. Slowly, agonizingly, the lead ship was dragged back onto solid ice. They checked the damage, drank a shot of vodka to calm their nerves, and kept driving. They reached the South Pole, shocking the Americans at the Amundsen Scott base. The US scientists watched in awe as these 3 massive, orange, tank-like buildings rolled out of the white mist, carrying men who had just driven across the roof of the world. The Kharkovchankas were so over-engineered that they didn't just do one mission. They stayed in Antarctica. While the original snow cruiser failed in days, the Kharkovchankas served for decades. They became the workhorses of the Soviet Antarctic expedition. They hauled fuel, food, and equipment to the most remote stations on the planet. They were repaired with duct tape, wire, and ingenuity. They were driven until the metal fatigued and the insulation rotted. In 1975, a second generation was built, the Kharkovchanka II. It was more modern, and crucially, they moved the engine outside the living quarters. But the veterans missed the old number 1. They said the new ones were colder because they didn't have the giant hot engine keeping them warm at night. The end of the original fleet was slow and quiet. One by one, they broke down beyond repair. In the brutal logic of Antarctica, you don't tow a dead vehicle home. It costs too much fuel. You leave it. In 2008, the very last operational Kharkovchanka 1 finally died. It suffered a major transmission failure in the middle of nowhere. The cost to recover it was astronomical. So, the crew did the only thing they could do. They cleaned the cabin, they made the beds, they put the books back on the shelf. They locked the heavy steel doors to protect it from the wind, and they walked away, getting a ride on another tractor. Today, that machine is still there. It is sitting alone in the vast whiteness, slowly being buried by the drifting snow. Because of the extreme cold, there is no rust. Inside, it is a perfect time capsule of the Soviet Union in 1959. There are likely still charts on the table, canned food in the pantry, and the smell of diesel soaked into the walls. It stands as a monument to a specific kind of engineering philosophy. Heavy, loud, simple, and virtually indestructible. While the modern world relies on lightweight composites, computer chips, and heated seats, the Kharkovchanka relied on thick steel and determination. It proved that if you want to conquer the impossible, you don't need finesse. You need a tank that feels like a house. It was a land train in the truest sense, a machine that turned the most desolate, deadly place on Earth into a road trip. So the next time you complain about the legroom on a flight or the heater in your car, think of the Soviet explorers. Think of 6 men locked in a vibrating steel box, choking on smoke, driving blindly across the ice, trusting their lives to the woman from Kharkov. Thanks for watching Iron Legacy. If you enjoyed this story of the ultimate survival machine, hit the subscribe button and let me know in the comments. Could you handle living inside a noisy steel box with 5 other people for 3 months? Or would the cabin fever drive you out into the snow? See you in the next one.